So this is the first lecture on Death of a Salesman. It has a very dramatic beginning, because when Willy Loman, suitcase in hand, walks slowly into the set of Death of a Salesman, in one of the most famous stage entrances in 20th century drama, he begins the long elegiac recounting, the long requiem. Requiem is R-E-Q-U-I-E-M, requiem, a song of lamentation. That's a requiem, a song which mourns a death. So when he does this, he actually begins a long requiem that finally announces itself as such in the play's closing moments. And this work, the dramatist Arthur Miller had said, I quote Miller, "This work is written from the sidewalk instead of from the skyscraper." This work is written from the sidewalk instead of from the skyscraper. Unlike Willy's two sons, the audience hardly needs to wait for his wife's pronouncement to understand that the man is exhausted. A small man can be just as tired as a great man, from the text. The proletarian working class attitude of the playwright, that it permeates the entire drama. The Willy Loman, the salesman working on commissions that no longer come, is of course down and out on his luck. Of course, he didn't ever have really any luck. Happy, who is a big talker, is the perpetual assistant to his company's assistant. Biff, who unlike his father knows that he's a dime a dozen, is the aging fair-haired boy gone waste. And their mother, Linda, the housewife, the homebody, ignored by time and ignored by the men all around her, is unable to stem the flow of events, the tide of events that soon engulfs them all, however hard she tries. The whole question of tragedy and the common man, the subject of one of Miller's seminal important essays of the same period, is very neatly captured, one can say, in the play's evocative subtitle, Death of a Salesman, Certain Private Conversations in 2 Acts and a Requiem. That's the subtitle of the play. Death of a Salesman's immediacy, accessibility, and one can say intergenerational appeal is a final tribute to Linda's great moment of lucidity, which occurs pretty early in the play. She says, attention must finally be paid to such a man. Miller's challenge was great, formidable. How to construct a play that was, on the one hand, anecdotal and very specific and particular, and on the other hand, which has to be widely and pervasively, richly representative, symbolic, and sometimes even mythical. From the very beginning, the work, which was originally called The Inside of His Head, that was the first title, initial sort of proposition, the draft with which Miller worked, the inside of his head. So from early on, this work seemed to cry out for a practical stage solution, which was extremely difficult, which had to be innovative, because it was hard to find, it was elusive. How can one render the past, the present, and the protagonist's increasingly desperate imaginings for a future as one continuous whole, without falling back on the technique, the mechanical technique of flashbacks? And flashback was a term that Arthur Miller, disliked very much. The Death of a Salesman tone is realistic, but it presupposes a realism with a distinct difference. The naturalistic set that Miller relied upon for his early play, the successful play that he had written earlier, All My Sons, it was a great success. So that naturalistic set would no longer serve his purpose here. Because to make this play work, stage space would have to be explored very imaginatively. It has to be re-envisioned, recalibrated, maybe in fact reinvented. Miller's much celebrated collaboration with the director Elia Kazan and the brilliant designer Joe Mielziner, Mielziner, Joe Mielziner. These two collaborations resulted in the construction of a highly atmospheric sort of platform set, a platform set that gave Death of a Salesman the look and the flexibility that its narrative drive demanded. On a multi-level set like this, time past and time present could be in constant dialogue with one another, as a sort of rhythmic pattern of renegotiation, which constantly emerged due to this interaction, due to this dialectic. All that was needed to signal temporal change of time, temporal transition, was light, stage lighting. And that was accompanied by the sound of a flute playing somewhere in the distance. Now, given such a highly unusual design concept, Arthur Miller's what he wanted, a dream rising out of reality, quote unquote, that is what he wished for. This dream rising out of reality could be made concrete, could be made material, and could be absolutely sort of pinned down on the stage. It could be centered on the stage. No one involved in the original production of Death of a Salesman in 1949, least of all the author, Miller, was sure that this sort of great experimentation, one can even say it's a gamble, this gamble would work. The producer of this, the very first production, 1949, was Kermit Bloomgarden, and he was one of the play's principal backers, and he had recommended a different title for the play. He was convinced that no one would buy a ticket to show a ticket to a play which showed or which advertised death of a salesman. I mean, that's not a good thing to do. And he suggested an alternative title, Free and Clear, as a sort of title, Free and Clear, highlighting Linda's speech in the Requiem, which brings closure to the play. Of course, Arthur Miller refused. The work, he said, I'm quoting, the work I wrote is called Death of a Salesman, quote unquote, period. When the curtain came down on the first night of the first performance in Philadelphia, where it was first performed, it was followed by a sort of awkward silence. There was tension. Miller relates this in his autobiography, Time Bends, Arthur Miller's autobiography called Time Bends, Timebends, together, Time Bends. And Miller states that it was a real, palpable tension. A lot was at stake. Not only for the playwright, but for the future of the American theatre. And then, after the silence, finally there was thunderous applause, followed by the oddest thing of all, men and women wept openly. And after the applause died down, members of the audience refused to leave and started talking to complete strangers about how deeply they had been affected by the play. Miller, who had thought that he had written a tough and hard-hitting exposure of the dangerous and deceptive myth of the American dream, making it big in America, was entirely unprepared for the emotional punch that Salesman delivered in performance. And finally, his play had, in a way, found, one can say, as great plays do, had found a life of its own. The very strong effect Death of a Salesman continues to have on Miller's audiences can be so daunting. The emotions that the play inspires, excites, can be so raw that the drama quickly can become, despite its author's proclaimed intentions, something quite different from a thesis play. Miller almost had a thesis play in mind, and it was not what had happened. And this may have little to do with the protagonist's socioeconomic status as the essential, the quintessential low man, Willie Loman, Loman, but low man, Low, separate, Man, low man. Of course, the playwright took the name from Fritz Lang's The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, the 1933 film in which a detective hopes to redeem himself by exposing a gang of forgers. And then, duped by them, instead he shouts into the telephone to his former boss, "Loman, help me for God's sake, Loman." Later in the same film, we meet the crazed detective in the asylum and he shouts into an invisible phone, "Loman, Loman, Loman." What the name really meant to me, Miller said, I quote, was a terrified man calling into the void for help that will never come, unquote. And thinking about his own Loman in the notebook that he kept while working on the first draft for the play, Miller wrote this, I quote, "Remember the character's size, quote unquote, his ugliness, quote unquote. Remember his attitude, quote unquote. Remember above all pity, quote unquote. Pity, P-I-T-Y. Although we generally think of Miller as a playwright with a narrative rather than a visual imagination, Death of a Salesman relies on a profound sense of stage imagery. The set is the play. The set is Miller's play. Dwarfed by looming apartment blocks that rob the sunlight from Willie's garden, and one can assume that they rob the sunlight as well from his own soul, the Loman house belongs to some other moment in time and a very different sense of place. What threatens both is impermanence and the flux of change. America is on the move. Everything is moving, shifting, in flux, but the Loman sanctuary stands still. Now this is nevertheless Brooklyn, but a reimagined Brooklyn in which windows like so many threatening eyes stare down on a diminished world that seems ever more diminished and inconsequential. There's more people now, quote unquote. Willie cries out in an anger that is really a sign of his despair. Bricks and windows, windows and bricks, quote unquote, taken from the text. This frames his claustrophobia, which the set renders as agonizingly real. On top of this music too tells the story. Each of Willie's journeys into the past, including one double journey, is signaled by the sound of a single, sad, solemn, plaintive flute. His father significantly made his own flutes by hand, then sold them from a wagon by himself, always on the move. Willie's suitcase carries unspecified samples of factory-made goods, and other sounds will be similarly evocative and will similarly advance the plot. The recorded sound of a child on a tape reciting the capital of every state in alphabetical order drowns out Willie's cry for help, and Biff is cautioned against whistling in the elevators. Of course, he does that anyway. The Lomans are actually great whistlers, and they all say G, a boy's word, not a man's. G. Finally, when Willie's life comes crashing down all around him, we hear frenzy of sound, quote unquote, as his car starts up and races away ominously at full speed. What follows, his accident, quote unquote, is the soft pulsation of a single cello string. The soft pulsation of a single cello string. In Death of a Salesman, as elsewhere in the entire repertoire of Arthur Miller's plays, the atmospheric dimension is very powerfully there to enhance the work's narrative authority and appeal. This is first and foremost the theatre's most compelling representation of the dark underside of the so-called American dream. Here it is rendered as half fantasy, half phantasmagoria, configured as it is like some triumphalist and everywhere disturbing, everywhere present, a sort of guy culture. Guy, G-U-I, the man culture or guy culture. Willie, as we are told in the Requiem, never knew who he was. But he was also, as Miller has said elsewhere, a man who chased everything that rusts. He had all the wrong dreams. Caught up, like most of post-war America, in the vain and unobtainable lure of success, which he equates with material wealth, popularity, and the making of a good impression. Remember the lines from the text? Be liked well and you shall never want. Be liked well and you shall never want. Doing all these things, he realizes all too late that what he has been searching for all his life, he has had all along. And this is something that is not negotiable. And that is Biff's unqualified love. What makes the play a tragedy, and it certainly is a tragedy, is that the father's unfulfilled ambitions, rather than any insurance premiums, are the only inheritance he can offer his sons. His legacy is their peril. I'm not bringing home any more prizes, quote unquote. Biff. What Biff is saying is that you will have to love me anyway. But by that time, it is too late. Willie drives off and kills himself. And in Death of a Salesman, in many ways, Miller transforms Greek tragedy and in a way brings Greek tragedy down, crashing to the level of earth, to the level of our lived lives. I'll